want to really see something that said, take a look at what happened.
This is an India Today Global exclusive. I'm being joined by Sabrina Siddiqui, senior journalist with Wall Street Journal, tracked the Vice President's office very closely, Kamala Harris's office very closely, and now she will also be tracking the campaign trails of the presidential nominee, should that be declared. Sabrina, thank you so much for joining us here. The fact that just not so long ago we were thinking this is going to be a walkover for Trump, it no longer is that. The fact that there is going to be a new face, and that surely could mean Kamala Harris with the delegates now backing her. How does she look? Where does she stand right now?
I think that this has been an extraordinary moment in American politics because it's extremely rare for any party to replace its presidential nominee this late in the race. I mean, there's just over 3 months to go until the election. And there's always been this question of whether or not Vice President Kamala Harris would have to step in for President Biden, especially as there was so much focus on his age. And this appears to be her moment. I think there's a historic nature of her candidacy that is really key here because she is the first woman as to serve as vice president, as well as the first Black person, the first of Indian descent. I think that there's going to be, a new wave of enthusiasm among voters within the Democratic Party who were pretty disillusioned with having President Biden at the top of the ticket and had wanted someone else to run instead. So, the Trump campaign just a few weeks ago was looking like it was in a very strong position, especially after President Biden's really disastrous debate against former President Trump. They looked like they were in a really strong position. But this is probably the most energized you've seen the Democratic Party now, with Vice President Harris replacing President Biden, probably the most energized they've been since the start of the campaign.
Well, Sabrina, there was a lot of talk on who will replace President Biden should he withdraw. And we do know that he came out first with a long statement of his pullout, and then with another tweet confirmed that he certainly is going to endorse or endorsed Kamala Harris. In such a scenario, we're now looking at a lot of support, but is there a backroom war, so to say, within the Democratic Party that continues? Because there will be a virtual roll of call. Is it going to be on August 1st or August 7th, when officially they will declare the number of delegates that are supporting Kamala Harris?
I think it's been pretty remarkable just how quickly the Democratic Party has coalesced behind Vice President Harris. There were some people, and I think that you still hear from some of those voices, who felt like there should be an open process, that they should have some kind of small primary where perhaps, other candidates can step in, and there could be, some kind of competition or debate over who replaces President Biden. But because Kamala Harris is the vice president, she was chosen specifically to step in the event that something happens to President Biden or that he is no longer able to campaign. I think that there was just a sense that it has to be her. She looks pretty comfortable. Obviously, she's already, the presumed nominee because of the delegates who are backing her. There will be some kind of roll call nomination, but maybe by August 7th. And then the Democratic Party convention is in Chicago. And I really do think it's going to be a coronation and a show of unity by the party, even if some people felt like perhaps they should have given others a chance. But, I think what's really notable is that a lot of the other prominent Democrats, there's a lot of governors or other politicians within the Democratic Party who were often named as possible presidential contenders in the future. All of them decided to not throw their hat in the ring, and they all uniformly backed Vice President Harris. So it just shows that I think there's not a lot of appetite with only 3 months remaining for there to be this sense of infighting within the party. And certainly, I think they just felt like what they need to do is unify behind an alternative to President Biden and refocus the party's energy on defeating former President Trump in November, because the more they drag this out, I think the more it would have actually hurt their chances. Now they can go in and just refocus on the campaign.
Well, like I said, Sabrina, it is not going to be a walkover for Trump, but how difficult does it look for the Democrats at this point in time with only 100 days to go and having a new person on the ticket? Do they have their strategy in place, or are they still in complete disarray?
I think that one thing that is also why they went with Vice President Harris is because this is the most seamless transition. She was already part of the reelection campaign, right? It was the Biden-Harris 2024 campaign because she was obviously going to be President Biden's running mate again. So one thing that's working for the Democrats here is they already have the infrastructure in place to support Vice President Harris. But I think that, look, to your point, it is really hard because now with just 3 months to go, they don't have to introduce Vice President Harris to the public. Everyone knows who she is, but they have to talk a little bit more about her record. She's focused a lot on reproductive rights for women, access to abortion. She's focused on issues like voting rights and, measures to reduce gun violence here in America. So they kind of, I think, need to talk up what she has done over the course of this first term that a lot of Americans may not have been paying attention to. And I also think that, some of the attacks that you're seeing from the Trump campaign and from some of the right wing within the country, they are targeting Vice President Harris on the basis of race, on the, some of the attacks are being viewed as misogynistic as well. So I think that it's going to probably also be a very ugly campaign. And so that's something that Democrats are also bracing for, trying to make the case to the American public, because given Hillary Clinton's loss to, President Trump back in 2016, that, this is potentially the time to elect the first woman to the White House. I think that's also going to be something that Democrats lean into very heavily as they try to draw a contrast with the record of the Biden-Harris administration and that of the Trump administration that came before it.
But then that's exactly the point, Sabrina. Is the country really ready to vote in a Black woman president, the first Black Asian woman president?
That's something that is very real. It's something that the Harris campaign is very much aware of. And I think that that's why whoever she chooses as her running mate is going to be very interesting here because, she's got a short list of possible people, Democratic Party politicians, who she is now going to choose as her running mate as a possible vice presidential contender. And I think a lot of those choices are, comprised of white men. They're pretty safe choices, in part, I think, to offset, any of the backlash that they think voters might have at the polls at the idea of electing a woman or a Black woman to the White House. So they know that the politics can be really complex here. But I also think that, when you think about the backbone of the Democratic Party, the backbone of the Democratic Party is voters of color, Black and brown voters. It's women, it's single women. So, these is young voters as well, young voters who are, grown up in a much more diverse society and are much more progressive. So I think what they can do is probably tap into this sense of enthusiasm and hope that, Vice President Harris actually energizes their base. And, obviously there's always going to be a faction of Americans who may not be ready, but as long as Democrats are able to activate their voters and enough of their voters, then that could make the difference.
Sabrina, has the incident of the assassination attempt, has that really changed dynamics within the country? And will that impact any further chances of Democrats returning to power?
I think that what that assassination attempt on former President Trump did is obviously, it put more attention on the threat of political violence here in America. And certainly there was this kind of wave of sympathy that you saw toward former President Trump, but I don't think it's necessarily changed the trajectory of the election. I think when it was President Biden that Trump was running against, it seemed like it was having more of an impact just because if you looked at the totality of those couple of weeks, first Biden had that really underwhelming debate performance. There was all this talk about whether or not he should be replaced. Then there's this assassination attempt on former President Trump that Biden has nothing to do with, of course, but it just, everything looked like it was, pointing to a period of time where Trump was going from strength to strength in terms of just garnering support from people, from voters. And now I think, with this shakeup in the race and Vice President Harris, it's kind of more of a reset. I think there may be some talk of, or some more focus in this campaign on the specter of political violence here in the US. But I think, that's more of a question of how that was even made possible. What were the loopholes in Secret Service? It's more of an investigative matter than I think it is a political or campaign issue.
You think they can use this as something that to push their agenda forward? Is that a political agenda for the Trump camp right now, or you think it's done and dusted, and that this no longer is going to be an important matter?
I think for the Trump campaign, it's something that they are certainly going to use to try and galvanize support for the former president. And, they immediately came out, Republicans, I should say, immediately came out and were kind of pointing the blame at Democrats, suggesting that rhetoric from President Biden and Democrats was part of what contributed to this, even though there's been no indication of the shooter's motivations, or even any indication that he was motivated by politics, because apparently the shooter had actually looked up photos of both former President Trump and President Biden. So I think what you saw from Republicans that you might continue to see is using that incident as an effort to paint Democrats as being extremists, or Democrats, as contributing to this highly polarized environment. I think the irony, of course, to that is that, it's actually former President Trump and Republicans, at least in this country, who have used language that is a lot more inflammatory about their political opponents. Obviously, former President Trump is currently under criminal investigation for incitement with respect to the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in 2021. So, I think it's more of a talking point among Republicans, but certainly something that they will probably use to energize their base. I don't know that it's something that's really weighing on the minds of middle of the road voters, of swing voters who are weighing their options between either of the candidates that they have to choose from.
Sabrina, let's just focus on Kamala Harris right now. We have seen her in the past in the debates during the last elections, some of which she got right, but quite a few of them she was absolutely demolished by her opponents. Do you think she has the wherewithal to really take on Trump in terms of the presidential debates? Because now we will be looking forward to what that really looks like, which was an absolute disaster when it came to President Biden.
I think that one thing that's different this time around is that Vice President Harris, she's got a different team that's running her campaign. In fact, she's retaining the campaign manager who was, or she's maintaining some of the top advisors, I should say, who were managing the Biden reelection campaign. Last time, to your point, she had a really challenging run for the Democratic Party's nomination. There were a lot of missteps within her campaign. I think it had less to do with her capabilities as much as it had to do with strategy. But, this is a different scenario because it's not a primary. It's a general election where she's got the entire Democratic Party infrastructure behind her. She's got donors, party activists, grassroots supporters behind her. There are super PACs that are going to be running, a lot of ads across TV, propping up her campaign. So it's a much more, I think, equal fight when you're looking at the dynamics between Vice President Harris versus former President Trump, and comparing that to what was a very crowded Democratic primary back in 2020 when she last ran for president. I also think she is actually a very effective communicator. So when she was in the Senate, she was on one of the committees and was known, especially as a former prosecutor, for her really, effective questioning of witnesses who came to testify before Congress. She's someone who I think Democrats feel like is a very good messenger. And this, I think the contrast between her and former President Trump is something they feel very good about. They, imagining her on a debate stage with Trump, it's just a wholly different split screen than when you saw former President Trump standing up there with President Biden.
Absolutely. But there are some who really criticize Kamala Harris for the positions she's taken. Economist said that she's long on ambition but short on convictions, which basically means an opportunist. In terms of her position and standing on death penalty, she moved from supporting it to defending, to being against it. On Israel-Gaza conflict, we see a conflicting situation when it comes to the position that the Democratic Party and the government of the day has taken, and she is vice president. So she actually is going to carry a lot of baggage of the administration because she's part of the administration. She's not so fresh to come up with ideas that are going to be really different from what Biden administration had to offer. Trump, on the other hand, it's a black and white with the Trump campaign. They know exactly what they want to say. They're okay talking about deportation, immigration, Israel. very specifically so, the position that they have, Russia-Ukraine war. Do you think Kamala Harris on the ticket will be able to convince the voters that what they have done in the past has been good enough and that she will continue, or she will change a few things when she goes from here on? Because she comes with that baggage, Sabrina.
I think that's one of the challenges before her. Her approval ratings, like President Biden's, have been fairly low, although it's very common for a vice president's approval ratings to be tied to those of the president. One of the biggest issues that President Biden was contending with when he was running was that although the US economy has done very well under his watch, they were struggling to communicate that to voters. Voters in America didn't actually feel like the economy was in a stronger position, even though it was. So, that's where I think Kamala Harris's communication skills come into play. Is she going to be more effective as a messenger for the accomplishments of this administration? I think Gaza was a huge vulnerability for President Biden because there's a lot of backlash from Democratic voters toward his staunch support for Israel and decision to continue arming Israel with U.S. weapons despite the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I think you might see Vice President Harris draw a little bit of distance from President Biden's policy in the region, because she was actually one of the earlier proponents of calling for a ceasefire. You already see a little bit of daylight between how President Biden talked about the Israel-Hamas war and how Vice President Harris is talking about it. And immigration is always, of course, a highly political issue here. But I think that, they know that Republicans are very clear in their platform on some of these issues. And so I think what Democrats are going to lean into are the issues that they feel are a vulnerability for Republicans. So you're going to hear Kamala Harris talk a lot about abortion, about reproductive rights. That is a huge liability for Republicans anytime it's part of the conversation. And you're probably going to hear her talk a lot about the chaotic nature of the Trump administration, restoring alliances on the global stage, the instability that I think a lot of people may have forgotten about under Trump. So that's probably going to be the contrast that Democrats lean into. But to your point, there's going to be some issues where I think Vice President Harris is going to have to draw some distance with the Biden administration. And she wasn't obviously always making every decision. She's the vice president, not the president. But then, it's also about coming up with effective messaging to not only remind people what they didn't like about the Trump administration, but to also sell the accomplishments of the Biden-Harris administration. And that's where their focus will be.
Before I let you go, Sabrina, I can't not ask you the India question. Let's just do that. Trump vis-a-vis Kamala Harris, who do you think would be better for India? Or what are the positions that you think would be very difficult for India should Trump should Trump come to power, or should Kamala Harris become president?
I actually think that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have been incredibly friendly toward India and prioritize the U.S.-India relationship. I don't think you're going to see a lot of meaningful change. I think that the Biden administration, of which Vice President Harris is a part, was obviously very focused on forming a closer alliance with India as a counterweight to China and its influence in the Indo-Pacific. So, you saw obviously the Biden administration host the state visit for Prime Minister Modi and forge all these deals across issues like trade, climate, technology. And I think that would continue no matter who is in the White House come January, whether it's President Trump or former President Trump or Vice President Harris. I think what you might see, and we saw this with President Biden, of course, is a little bit more scrutiny over India's position on the Russia-Ukraine war. If it's Vice President Harris, wanting India to, be more, I think, wanting India to be more critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and maybe scale back some of its defense partnership with Russia. And you may see a little bit more of that focus that you saw under the Biden administration of, when it comes to issues of human rights, free speech, democracy. But fundamentally, the relationship is not going to change, whether it's former President Trump or Vice President Harris. Both, I think, Republicans and Democrats see India as a vital partner to the United States, and I think want to continue on this path of forming a much closer alliance between Washington and New Delhi, not creating more distance between the two capitals.
Well, trade cooperation under Trump could become a little more difficult, Sabrina, given that he's already said in one of his rallies that He's brought back the Harley Davidson question on the tax and the import duties. So India already contemplating how would that look for India should Trump come back to power. That certainly is an area of concern for India when it comes to trade, because India certainly wants to go ahead, forge stronger trade ties with the United States of America. Having said that, my last question to you before I let you go. What are the names doing the rounds as front runners for the running mate of Kamala Harris, should she be on that ticket?
Well, it's a lot of governors within the Democratic Party, and like I said, largely a group of white men, which I think is a strategic choice to play it safe. But you have a governor from the state of Pennsylvania whose name is Josh Shapiro. He's been a rising figure within the Democratic Party. Governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper. There's also a senator from Arizona, Mark Kelly, who's well known here. And I think these are some of the names that we're hearing come up often in these conversations. But I also, Governor Andy Beshear, who's from Kentucky, these are all basically people who've been coming up within the Democratic Party over the last few years. I also think what the campaign is thinking about is what are the key battleground states and which of these politicians may be able to help Democrats win one of the must-win swing states in November. So if you pick a popular governor from Pennsylvania or North Carolina, both of which are important battlegrounds for Democrats to try and hold on to, then the thinking here is maybe that could help bring some of the voters along with that choice. So those are the names we're hearing, but as you know, it's always unpredictable, and we never really know until the last minute. But certainly, I think that that's a decision that we're going to be getting very soon, because they have to have all this wrapped up going into the Democratic convention in August.
Sabrina Siddiqui, thank you so much for joining us here on the India Today Network.
Thank you.